All right, Harry Sister, we're in the unique position, I believe, where you and I may have a slight agreement here about all this. So what was your view of the Fuentes interview?
Piers, I don't think it's a slight agreement. I think it's a full agreement. First and foremost, I do want to start off by saying I thought the way that you conducted the interview was fantastic. I watched the entire thing, and you, I think, were the only interviewer so far to really hold Nick Fuentes accountable and not let him get away with a lot of his hateful views. I loved how you played the clips side by side and made him defend it on the record. So I want to give props to you there. I thought it was really well done. And I watched the entire thing. And I was trying to decide, similar to you, does Nick Fuentes actually believe these things, or is he doing it for the money? Is it performative? And I might disagree slightly with you. I think it's both. I think he does believe some of these things, and I think some of it's performative. I think when he tried to moderate himself, that's performative. But the more hateful views that, as you mentioned, when the mask kind of slipped, that's what he truly believes. You could tell that he was trying to moderate himself when, as you were talking about with Dr. Phil, talking about the Holocaust. He said, oh, I believe it was the Holocaust, at least 6 million Jews. He said that, but then simultaneously claimed that Hitler is cool and that he liked his uniforms and the music and things like that. So, no, I think Nick Fuentes broadly is a sad, insecure man. I think he's a liar. I think he's a grifter. And I think you exposed that in the interview.
Andrew Wilson, what did you think?
Well, I was just watching your previous segment, and I thought that the framing there was a little off. So I've always appreciated coming on the show and you letting me get my viewpoints out. But I do take some issue with your framing. You did bring up the guy's dad, and you said his name. And when you said it on the air that way, this is a person who has had people attempt to assassinate him. They have come to his house, shown up at his door, and tried to kill him. And that's on video happening. And so when you said the guy's name and then try to tie it into racism, I know that you know this, Piers, but the left broadly will do these harassment campaigns. These harassment campaigns are designed specifically to incite the violence of many of their mentally ill followers.
Andrew, let me just say,
that's what they do.
Yeah, let me just say, if I had my time again, I wouldn't have said his father's name. But I would have still told the anecdote because I thought it was really important to Nick Fuentes.
The anecdote's not the relevant part.
But the anecdote is relevant. Yeah. The anecdote is relevant when he immediately tried to attack me for ambushing him with a story that he told himself on his show. I mean, look, if I told a story like that...
But that's not what people are upset about.
No, I understand.
They weren't upset about the anecdote. They were upset that you specifically said the guy's name after Fuentes has had these assassination attempts on him.
To be clear... if I had my time again, wouldn't have said his father's name, notwithstanding the fact you can find it in 2 seconds on the internet. Right? So it's not like it's not difficult to find. But I do think it's important that anecdote, to me, was potentially very relevant to why Nick Fuentes is the way he is about racism, for example. Because he was telling a story that cannot be construed, Andrew, any other way than his father was directing them away from restaurants because of his racist views about the people that go in them or run them. And it couldn't be seen any other way.
I get that. I get the point of bringing the anecdote up, but that wasn't what looked to me like what was making these guys so angry, was not the anecdote itself, but the fact that you said the guy's name, referenced it as his dad, and then this guy's had assassination attempts.
Yeah, but the story was him telling the story.
By the way, hang on. And a lot of the first assassination attempt happened because of the "Your Body, My Choice" thing that he put that tweet out, and people began doxing his address and his family's name, and that's why they showed up to kill him. So the guy's grievance there, I think, is legitimate.
Yeah, but I think it's important that. His grievance wasn't just that I named his father, which, again, is a matter of public record. You can find it anywhere, although I wouldn't have said it if I had my time again, because I don't want to attack his family for the sake of attacking his family. It was when he tried to frame it as an unfair attack on his family, when I think actually the story that he himself put in the public domain was potentially very relevant to why he is the way he is. I as a journalist...
Well, how he was framing it was you're bringing this up and name doxing specifically so that you can rally people into a harassment campaign. That's how he saw it.
No, but that wasn't... Yeah, okay, but just to be clear again, that was not my intention. My intention was to ask him, in all sincerity, if you grow up in an environment at home where there is clear racism that you have discussed yourself on your own show very like unarguably, you can't listen to the clip. I played it earlier without realizing that's what he's saying. Then, is that relevant to the way he is? Let me bring in Mark Lamont Hill here. I mean, Mark, I didn't do that lightly. I had decided before I did the interview that I would do a lot of research into this. I would find all the clips that I felt were the most incendiary things he'd said on the record, and I would ask him and push him about them in a way that I don't think anyone else has really done. And it would be interesting to see the way he responded. And if you're going to talk to Nick Fuentes, who openly admits to being a racist, he did it again with me in the show, that anecdote to me was pertinent to why he may have shaped those views. What do you think? Was it unfair?
I think the anecdote was entirely fair and necessary, particularly since, the first part of the interview was very much about his biography. It was very much about what shaped him. He himself volunteered information, even in that interview, about his parents, about how they came together, about, the loss of their fathers, etc. All that to me is fair game. I agree that invoking his father's name in that moment was too far. I hear you saying if you could do it again, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
Because I do have some ethical and moral reservations about doxing. I don't think it's wrong, for example, if someone does something awful in public and it's relevant to the public interest to track down their job and notify their job. But that's not the same thing as tracking down every private citizen just because we think they're racist or sexist or anti-Semitic or homophobic. I may think you're that thing, but you have a right to be that thing, even though I think it's awful. And I don't think you should live without safety because of that. Now, there's a bigger question, Piers, that you raised at the top of the interview, and it's come up again in the media, and that is, should you even be talking to this guy?
Right.
And I got to be honest with you, Piers, I've struggled with this. I interview controversial people. I sit down with people who people say don't platform them, and I take seriously your point that they already have a platform. And I'm not making them big. I'm not drawing attention to them. They already have the attention. They're just not being questioned or challenged on that platform. I concede that point. I agree with you fully. The problem with this guy, the problem with Nick Fuentes in particular, though, to me, is he's such a chameleon, and he moves in such a way that I'm not sure holding him accountable matters to his base, and he does just enough to look moderate and normal and reasonable that I think he'll do more damage by sneaking some people from the middle and dragging them to his side because they think he's reasonable, and only later find out that he's a sexist, misogynist, Hitler-loving Nazi, right, or whatever he is, right? That's where the danger comes for me. I'm not saying we should interview controversial people. I'm just saying this particular guy, I feel like we're playing into his interests and his angle.
Yeah, well, Glenn Greenwald, welcome back to Uncensored. You've had Fuentes on your show. What's your view about that issue, about platforming him at all?
Oh, I didn't even consider it to be a difficult question at all. I mean, if you're going to have people on who are responsible for the invasion and destruction of Iraq based on lies, or the incineration of Vietnam, or the destruction of Gaza and the death of tens of thousands of people, and welcome them and treat them like respectable people, tell me what it is that Nick Fuentes has done remotely as bad as that justifies allowing them to come on and speak, but not him. And whether you like it or not, he does speak for a huge number of people in his generation, and even other generations as well, who feel the same kind of anger and frustration with the status quo, with the establishment, with the kind of dogma that we've been told we have to accept. And there's a lot of people who are angry about it and who rebel against it. And we saw this with Donald Trump on maybe a little bit of a smaller scale, but very much the same pattern. When Donald Trump appeared, everybody was like, oh, he's racist and fascist and he's the misogynist and he's this and that. And no one wanted to grapple with the reason why his message was resonating so much. And to me, it is very similar to Nick Fuentes. Say what you want about him. He's extremely smart, an incredibly talented communicator, and very well read. Like, he's very informed. He's not just some sensationalist babbling on the internet. And I think the reason he has attracted a lot of attention is because he's speaking to the anger and frustration, a lot of which is valid, of a lot of people. And to stick your head in the sand and say, oh, we're going to pretend that this isn't happening because his views are too off, but the people who start wars or are responsible for the 2008 financial crisis, these are respectable people who we treat with respect, like Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or whoever. That, to me, is the kind of thing that I think is really distorted.
Yeah, Warren Smith. I'll respond
to that.
Well, no, let me bring in Warren Smith first, and then I'll come back to you, Mark. Warren, that really is my feeling about it. Is that you can let these guys like Fuentes and Andrew Tate run riot, and And they do already, and they have massive followings, millions and millions of young men. I know, when I interview Tate, the number of young men who just come up to me in the street to ask about it is off the charts, more than almost any other guest I ever have. So we can either pretend this phenomenon isn't happening, and Fuentes is a phenomenon, whether people like it or not. And I don't hate everything about him. There were elements of that interview where it was a genuinely quite interesting conversation. But there were elements which, either because he wanted to be performative and shocking and attention-seeking, whatever it may be, or because he really believes it, where I felt we saw a pretty dark underbelly of some of his beliefs. You know, I mean, just when somebody just says, I am a racist, and then explains, let me play the clip first, then come to you. You're fine with saying you're a racist?
Totally. I think everybody's racist. I think everybody, if we're being honest, is racist. I think everybody, the only people that aren't racist or pretend not to be are white people to their detriment. Everybody else is racist.
But earlier in the interview, you got aggrieved at the idea that your father was a racist. You wanted to make emphatically sure.
Yeah, because my father's...
He's not.
Because my father doesn't share my same views on that.
So he's the exception to the everyone's a racist.
Well, everybody's a little bit racist.
I mean, I thought it was an interesting contradiction there, which he was probably calculating in real time, that having got so exercised about the idea that his father was racist, he then said everyone's racist and there's nothing wrong with it, effectively. But putting that to one side, Warren, I mean, you know, this issue of whether you platform somebody like Fuentes, who has these inflammatory views, I think we can all agree they're inflammatory, a lot of his views. Am I, by doing it, am I continuing to fuel this phenomenon in a way that is a negative for society? Or in a free democratic society, you know, should I be entitled to interview who the hell I like, as long as I do my job as a journalist of holding him to account over these things, let other people work it out for themselves?
No, I think it's totally understandable, and I agree that you would have him on. I was in the same position where I was genuinely shocked when I made a knee-jerk response video to something he had said. I was overwhelmed by the response. I was like, I had no idea there were this many people out there that agreed with him. And I had people that I knew actually telling me, no, you're oversimplifying this. And I actually went back and looked at the same clip and realized I had oversimplified it. There was actually, I was looking at it through the narrative, going into it without much prior research. And that actually led to me sitting down with him for an hour and a half. And I think it's important, though, if you want to achieve the ideal outcome, it is important to actually genuinely be trying to gain a better understanding of his reasoning and in his arguments, and not just trying to win or embarrass, because in the long run, I think that will backfire and that will cause him to become bigger.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You know, people were asking me, you know, he won, or people said you won. Or I said, look, I didn't seek out to win. I don't seek out ever to win an interview. That's not the point of an interview, actually. What I wanted to do over 2 hours was personally get to know him better, because I know nothing about him other than what I've read. I've never met him, I've never interviewed him. And B, to go over all these things which he's notorious for and actually work out the correct context, what he really believes, what may have motivated this, and so on. And I think a lot of that was achieved in the interview. But it wasn't, you know, I think it very quickly afterwards, you know, when I asked him during the interview, you know, how he felt, and towards the end, how he felt at the gun, he thought I'd been fair. He didn't think I'd ambushed him, and so on. He made that clear in the interview. And yet afterwards, almost immediately afterwards, he comes out full bore on the attack, which is what he does. But it was interesting to me that it was the reaction from his sort of mob of groypers was instantaneous and extraordinarily widespread. They just come as this mob, and it's you know, if you're not me, who's got a very thick skin, it's a pretty hard thing to get back at you. Look, I don't care. I've had a lot worse, and they'll move on, and that's what happens. But if you're not, actually, it can be very intimidating. It was very threatening. Very racist, very anti-Semitic, very, very nasty, actually. Like I said, it wouldn't scrape the surface with me because I got a skin of 1,000 rhinos. But to other people, I could see it really being a pretty terrifying experience.
Hey, Piers, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
They're doing that. They're doing that too.
Sorry, Glenn go first. Yeah.
Let me interrupt because it's really for everybody.
Hang on, guys. Don't talk at once. Let me start with Glenn.
Thanks, Mark. I'm sorry to interrupt. But the issue is, why does he have such a loyal following? Why does he have such a large and loyal following? Now, you can ask that question about Donald Trump, and a lot of people are satisfied by saying, oh, America's just filled with racists and misogynists and xenophobes, and he's playing into that. And maybe that is part of it. You know, politicians do demagogue and play to our worst instincts always, but there was a lot more to it than that. And I think people understand 10 years later that there is and was a lot more to that. So you can say, oh, yeah, Nick Fuentes has this army of angry young men who are incredibly devoted to him, who believe that he's speaking truth uniquely, because they're also a bunch of Nazis and racists and Jew haters. And okay, that's an easy. I think there's a lot more to it, and I think people ought to grapple with the reason why he's speaking for so many people.
I think that's a very valid point. You know, I've always said about Andrew Tate, for example, that, you know, a lot of the things he says, I can understand. If you're a young, slightly disenfranchised young man who feels society has got it in for you and all you ever hear is man bashing, I can understand why you gravitate to a guy like Tate, who stands there tall and proud as a very masculine kind of guy, beating his chest, talking about, you know, taking care of your body and getting fit and being a protector and all these things. I get all that. But then he slides into brazen misogyny, which I hate. Mark Lamont Hill, let me bring you in here. I mean, I just want to, before you say what you want to say, you know, what he said after the interview, Nick Fuentes, was Piers Morgan tried his best, but his hardball interrogation made me look even better than Tucker's wildly criticised softball interview. The regime can acquiesce like Tucker, or it can try to resist like Piers, but the result is inevitably the same: total Groyper victory. Now, look, you know, on one level, I admire his social media work, right? He goes on the attack, he gives it full bells, he claims total victory. It's very Trumpian, and it can work. It can be very effective, okay? And he's perfectly entitled to claim total victory and whatever, and I'm sure all his supporters agree. But it's interesting that he views me and Tucker Carlson and other people who now do our own shows or whatever as the regime. Almost like anybody who's older than him is part of some ancien regime that just doesn't get it. You know, all his supporters call me boomer, right? And I was like, I've been called that probably ever. Okay, I'm a boomer. I don't really know what that means, but it just means I'm an old dude who doesn't get it, right? And it may be, as Glenn says, there is a more interesting conversation to be had about why these guys get so popular. And it may be that when I do my slightly old school journalistic trick, as somebody put it, of just being quite tough and rigorous with questioning, that it's viewed by young people who gravitate to people like these guys as just an old boomer going through the motions.
Perhaps. I mean, and also I wouldn't assume that because he said that he believes it, that he actually believes you're part of the regime, or that he believes that one is softball or hardball. He gives a lot of the characteristics, mannerisms, approaches, styles of a cult leader. And cult leaders navigate their followers in very particular ways, including re-narrating or counter-narrating events that happen in ways that are favorable to them. That's why when I said I struggle with whether or not you should have him on the show, I didn't say you shouldn't, and I didn't say you should. It's a struggle for me. Again, as a journalist, I have interviewed despots, I've killers, you know, people, I mean, genocide leaders, I've done it all. And there are days where it feels very clear and obvious why I should do it. They need to be held accountable. They need to be forced to answer tough questions. And I don't put them in contrary to what was said, I don't hold them in a different box than I do Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden or someone who I voted for, you know, potentially, right? They all need to be held to scrutiny. Everybody in power needs to be held accountable. I'm with that. My concern in this particular case, though, is that I'm not sure what the net gain is. I don't know if you really got to know a better him, not because you didn't do a great job, you did do a great job, but because I'm not sure who the person is behind that persona. And the question I would ask you, Piers, is if you knew ahead of time that doing this interview would double the amount of people who believed in the worst things that he believes, would you still do the interview? If you knew ahead of time that it would double that
honestly
number,
don't think,
would you still do it?
Well, I don't think that is going to be a consequence of it, honestly. But what I do think is that
But if it were,
let me make my point. I don't like generalizing. When Hillary Clinton called Donald Trump supporters, the MAGA supporters, a basket of deplorables, it probably lost her that election. When you generalize about millions and millions of people, it's always a very precarious and stupid folly to do that. What I can say with some certainty is that pretty well 100% of his groypers who've directly messaged me or members of my family have been highly abusive, overtly racist, very misogynist, and many of them anti-Semitic. I can say that with certainty. Now, what I don't know is how many of those are human beings and how many are from a bot farm, because according to reports in the last 2 days, a lot of his stuff comes from bot farms. I don't know if that's true, but that's been reported in various mainstream papers.
I don't doubt it.
And I don't know how representative these ones on X or Instagram are of the total body of his support. I just don't know. So, I don't want to generalize and say
and neither do I, Piers.
I don't want to say all Nick Fuentes supporters are disgusting, because there may be a lot of people. It's a bit like Tommy Robinson.
And to be clear,
let me make my point.
I'm not saying that. To be clear, I'm not.
Let me finish my point.
Oh,
it's a bit like Tommy Robinson. Tommy Robinson in the UK, right, is a bit like Fuentes over here. And there's no doubt, as the people marching with him have grown bigger and bigger and bigger, the idea that they're all fascist, racist, whatever, is nonsense. A lot of people are marching for well-intentioned reasons connected with the immigration crisis in the UK, right? He has bad people as well, and I think he's a malevolent character. But again, I wouldn't generalize anymore about all these people that march.
Can I ask you a question, Pierce?
Yes, yeah, sure.
I would like to
but again,
dive into...
I didn't generalize.
Well, hang on, let Andrew come in. Let Andrew come in.
Okay.
There was a part of the interview where you were very combative and you said you haven't even been laid and you're a virgin. This guy's a Roman Catholic.
Right.
Isn't he supposed to be a virgin until he's married? Isn't that part of your guys' faith?
To be fair to him, that is. I was brought up a Catholic. I'm not a particularly devout Catholic. I disagree with a lot of the church's
But you
teachings.
do agree that Catholics are supposed to remain chaste until marriage, right?
The strict interpretation from the Catholic Church about that is you should be.
So how come he didn't get? Shouldn't he get credit for that?
Well, he couldn't.
The idea that he's kind of staying within the confines of his religious beliefs.
I have no problem, but he also
or he can't get any action.
But he also self-identifies as an incel, which is more problematic.
Here's what Mark just said. You see what I mean? Like, he can't get any action. The guy is rich as shit, and he's a good-looking guy. He could get action if he wanted it, Mark.
Teasing.
And by the way, hang on,
Andrew.
Hang on, Mark.
I agree with you, Andrew. I'm just teasing.
Just let me finish the point.
I agree with you. I'm just teasing.
What I'm saying to you, though, is that, yeah, of course he could. The thing is, though, is that if you guys are saying like he's a huckster, he's a fraud, isn't he in fact following rigorously his faith by doing that?
Well, so my response to that, I think it's
not what he said in the interview.
Hang on, Harry. I think it's
yes,
a really.
It is what he said in the interview.
I want to respond to Andrew.
No, it's not.
I think it's a perfectly valid question. Particularly as I have always said, I'm a Catholic. I was raised a Catholic. I had spiritual guidance from Catholic nuns when I was 12 years old. I go to church occasionally. I'm not devout. I'm not there all the time. I don't agree with some of the Catholic Church's views and policies, and I wish they would evolve faster. However, as speaking Catholic to Catholic with him, yes, it's a perfectly valid thing that he could say, I am saving myself for marriage. But if that's all he said, fine. But I would argue that, if you look at him as a Christian, for example, how many of his other views are compatible with being a Christian? Right?
His view on the priesthood, for instance,
racism
was correct.
His Jew baiting, his overt racism, the despicable way he talks about women generally, and so on. None of those things are what you would categorize as being a good Christian. So
I think you can have dogmatic distinctions with him, and that's fine within the confines of the faith. But with the points he brought up, when he said women aren't allowed to be clergy, that's true. They're not allowed to be clergy by the Catholic faith. And when he said he's saving himself for marriage,
but he also said he couldn't.
When he said women, Andrew, hang on, Andrew, when he said that women shouldn't be allowed to vote and should stay at home, i.e., shouldn't also have jobs. Would you agree with that?
The Catholic Church does not have dogmatic teaching on democracy. They're not like, oh, democracy is the standard for the world.
I'm asking you whether you think when he says women shouldn't be allowed to vote and should stay at home and not work.
Well, I think most people shouldn't be allowed to vote. I think I would limit suffrage for most people, like our founders did. I think it's a terrible idea to have universal suffrage.
Would you make it specific to women?
Gender,
not specific to
based on their
specific.
Hang on, hang on. Let me
But why would
finish
that
this with Andrew.
matter? Why would that matter?
Well,
Ultimately,
because I do think
would
if you
prefer to
say,
limit voting, yes.
I do think after they've waged a 100-year war, women for women's equal rights, to then remove one of the wrenching building blocks of that, which is what the suffragettes fought for, the right to vote. I think if you remove that...
Oh, come on. That whole movement was totally AstroTurf. That's one. And
Well,
two,
it won them the right
let's
to
just point
vote.
this out. There's a good argument from a Christian perspective to make that the husband, the head of the household, should be the one voting. Within his dogma, that would make sense. So there is a Christian case that you could make for that the head of household, the wife, right now, what goes on in Christian households is that the wife is just doubling the vote of the man, right? So this is not against the purview of Fuentes, and it doesn't even sound particularly misogynistic to me.